to the store to get gas, and I saw the video and started crying in the car, just like, oh my God. He comes out and I'm all teary eyed. He's like, what's up? And I'm like, oh. This is a Kenneth and Kenneth image from the site that is in Morocco. So the Morocco site and the new timeline for early Homo sapien is actually an old site. It's just new dating techniques on the old site. So this this sapien has been around, and our knowledge of this sapien has been around for since I think it's like the 70s. Just not dated as old as it was. Oh, I'm not in my office because I can't get the internet to stay stable in the office. And so trying to get my camera thing to work properly feels really weird sometimes. Okay, there we go. So I don't know if they've named him. I know that he's from the I gotta look up the site. Jebel Hold, and I'm probably mispronouncing that extremely incorrectly. That is the wrong. They make it so hard for me to comment, I swear. I put it in. And this is in Morocco, so in northern Spain. Sorry, not Spain, northern Iraq. My head. And that one is wrong too. I will replace words with the wrong words sometimes. It's unfortunately a part of my PTSD. Northern Africa. We still have not left Africa for the origin of sapien. So let me clarify and correct my verbiage because my words are flipping out on me for some odd reason. Not like it's not been a problematic day on any level. My words should not be flipping out on me. I'm not seeing that they have a name for him though. This image is from Kenneth and Kenneth. This is a reconstruction of the skull. They had thought that the skull was 40,000 years old for a while. And then the new dating on the skull puts the skull at 300,000 years old. And this is an, let me make sure I pronounce the isotope testing that they have for it correctly, because the isotope testings come in a couple of different. And Nope. They're going to talk about all the others before they're going to talk about his. I want to say that they did strontium isotope dating on it when I was reading it. So there's a couple of things that they've also come out with recently that talk about how we now know that our earliest start as Homo sapien is really kind of this mixture of several different bands of peoples whose intermix within their bands creates sapien. And so when we combine this, we're looking at a shift that's broad, right? That a shift that may now be within all of Africa, not just like south of the that forest band that's currently there. That's name I can't remember right off the top of my head. So when we're looking at that, what this tells us is when we're looking at those early bands that are all living together and still all really doing a lot of migration and a lot of traveling and a lot of interchange of culture and, of what culture is at that time, and then also a lot of interchange of ideas, right, which is very much culture, and a lot of change of genetics. The idea that you've got like Homo heidelbergensis living over here and Homo ancestor over here was never really an idea that most people thought within the archaeological community, or at least half of them within the archaeological community. There were more people within the lay community that thought that, um, but it's been completely blown out of the water. What we're seeing is that we have different groups all living together, different, at this time, species of humans or subspecies of humans living together. And by humans, I mean subspecies of Homo, generally subspecies of Homo erectus, all living together. And it is that living together that really gives that creation of us. Um, there is thought that the branch off with Naledi is a little bit further back than the branch off with others. Um, and there's also thought that, like, there's evidence that we see Boisei, Paranthropus boisei, and Habilis, and a couple of other species all in encampments together as well around this time, and that could have attributed to the development of Homo erectus as well. So it's now being thought that the creation of new of us species, of new human species, is not necessarily within isolation, though it absolutely happens within isolation. But it can also happen when you are seeing groups of different cousin species coming together and living together. And it is that mix of that genetic signature and all those different genomes and everything else that creates us, and it kind of broadens that out and makes it this very creative species that we are, right, this very unique species that we are, in some very impactful ways. So when we're looking at that start of us as sapiens coming from a mix of people within Africa at the time, and our start the start of our coalescing into one species instead of different, well, not into one species, into one group of sapien instead of different groups of Homo sapien, um, as a species, really finalizes, they're saying now, between 125 to 135,000 years ago. And so what they're saying is that before this, there are different groups of Homo sapien mixing or living among different groups of Heidelbergensis and different groups of ancestor, and these other Homo species, including Erectus, and that the start of us is like two or three or four different groups of sapien coming from different bands. When they think that we genetically become a group of Homo sapiens, this one here is 300,000 years old. When they start to become the singular group of Homo sapiens between 135 to 100 or to 25,000 years ago, by that time we've already seen early Homo sapiens actually moving outside of Africa. Their direct descendants aren't where they are at now, and those populations of early Homo sapien that move outside of Africa don't continue on into us today. And you see it come across as failed populations, and I'm not necessarily sure if they're actually failed populations or if they actually migrated home, and in that migration home, uh, you know, we're no longer in that area, no longer developed further within that area. So I'm not sure which of it is myself personally. I don't like the terminology failed populations. Hey. And so I would not necessarily say that they're failed populations. I would say that they're probably populations that have been exploring and went home. So what we're seeing is, and I've got a picture for this that I wanted to share, is that we have finds outside of, I think this is the one I liked. Yes. We have finds outside of Africa relatively early on for us as a species. It's a little bit hard to see some of these, and some of these that have are marked on here are not necessarily us. But when you see things like into so we're seeing into Eurasia, or not Eurasia, into some of them move over. So let's look at this find over here in Southeast Asia. This find over here in Southeast Asia goes back to like 120,000 years ago. Now, when they're looking at that, and I believe, and I got to get it close to see sometimes. Yes. Okay. So when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is early groups of us who make it out, may have gone back home, may have ended up staying out, but they're early groups who make it out. Now, what we're seeing is that going back into Africa, these green arrows that we see, these returns, these are happening all the time. The idea that at any point we are staying in one space at this point of time is really done. Like nobody believes that anymore. Hold on one second. And did it pop? It didn't pop it. Let me see if I can get it back because I can't. There we go. See otherwise. So those early groups moving out before 50,000 years ago, we know are not groups that we're genetically related to because they've been able to trace our DNA back to when they do is they take the DNA, and I'm not the expert in DNA. I'm just going by what I've read and understood. They take that DNA and they can trace it back by generations. And they can also trace what like the first of a mitochondrial DNA is and the first of a Y DNA. So the ancestor, they call it the mitochondrial Eve or the mitochondrial or the Y atom. They can trace that back to when that ancestor lived by looking at the patterns within the DNA. And in looking at the patterns in the DNA and tracing it back to when that ancestor lived, what you're looking at is the ability to trace when we moved into specific areas and when we moved out of specific areas. So, like when we have talked in here before about the fact that they can trace Indigenous Australians back 70,000 years, they have rock art that goes back that far. Uh, we also get the fact that uh, we see within their DNA that we can trace them back 70,000 years. When they talk about we can trace everybody else outside of Africa to 50,000 years, what we're talking about is that the departure of the mitochondrial Eve and the mitochondrial atom from that area starts at 50,000 years ago, and that everybody after that comes, or everybody outside of that space comes from the group that moves out, right? Ancestors back to that group that moves out. Now, it's important to note that people will move through space and into space. And once they've moved through space and into space, they're not the descendants of the people that then come into the space, sometimes with them or even after them. So we have a lot of people who will relate people to being from other groups or other spaces that they may have at one point moved through, but they're not descendant of the groups in those space now. Because the movement out is not looking at 100 people move out of the Levant area into uh, India, and the 100 people stay in India, and their children move from India to um, oh, Thailand. And then, the 100 children that left the 100 parents back there, they have their own kids, and those kids move into the islands of the South Pacific, right? That is not what's happening. What we're seeing is that you might have 100 people moving out, and say in one family group, you have somebody who has 15 kids, and five of those kids go here, and five of those kids go here, and five of those kids go here, right? They're not the same. We're also seeing that groups will move out and then be replaced by new groups, or they'll move further on and new groups will move into those places. So we can't look at it as uh, somebody is a descendant group of another group unless we're looking at something we can trace descendancy from, right? So uh, we can't look at the Australians as descendants from the Indonesians because they're below the Indonesians in that migration pattern scheme. Well, we know that the Australians have been there longer than the Indonesians have been there, right? So we can't look at it through our idea of what the map was, like what this, we can't look at it as a steady onward migration leaving your parents behind. We have to look at it as a constant flow of movement back and forth that will disperse in groups, and that whole group will move through and move on. Now, sometimes there are absolutely times where you see an entire group of people descend from a singular group, like the Germanic people. The Germanic people as a whole probably come, well, we know from the way that we can trace their DNA from a, early group that, may have been 100, maybe be 500 people moving out. And as they grow as a group, as they reproduce as a group, they start splitting off into different nations, different Germanic groups. And as those reproduce and they grow, and then those reproduce and they grow, we see that you go from, a small band of people who move out initially to the Germanic nation as a whole. We can see where we can trace language patterns, where that tracing of language pattern absolutely shows us where people migrating are carrying their language through, and where you can see descendancy patterns in that migration pattern. When you're looking, um, prior to 20,000 years ago, prior to, um, you know, really the mass dispersal across Eurasia with the end of the last ice age, when you're looking to movement prior to that, you're looking at groups who, like that map we're showing, are going out, and maybe they're going back, or maybe they're staying in that space. And instead of staying in that space and dying off, they're staying in that space and living and thriving. And that's how we get people in unique spaces today. So when we're looking at the way the movement of Homo sapien is across into Eurasia, what we're seeing in timeline is that after that 50,000 year mark, you see that Homo sapien first moves across the lower southwestern part of the continent of Eurasia, and into what is known of, yes, into what is known of up until the ice has melted completely and cleared off Eurasia as Sundaland. Um, and and I might have Sundaland and the other one, the lower mass, mixed up. But the ocean level is going to be a lot lower across Southwest Eurasia while that ice is melting. And as the ice melts, that ocean level rises. And we know that there are like hundreds of acres of land. Like there are, hundreds of miles of coastline that are absolutely present that are not there anymore. And so as people are moving across into these areas, um, we're seeing that some people are moving out and on. And then some people come and they kind of stay. And then some people come and they stay and they go back. We're seeing this southern half, or this southeast part, has much more land mass lower, But as the ice starts to shift up, people start to move up. Now, what we're seeing with timeline for travel to Australia, again, Indigenous Australians are there 70,000 years. So their group of human who left the Sudan, or not the Sudan, the Levant area is going to be a group of human that leaves the Levant area a little bit earlier. And as their group of human moves in, we know they come in contact with the Denisovan and they come in contact with a ghost species in Australia. Um, and there is evidence as well that as that they staying there come in contact with Turtle Island Indigenous people as Turtle Island Indigenous people cross over the islands of the South Pacific in the Ring of Fire. And again, we're seeing that through DNA, the people who end up in Turtle Island are more likely to have started leaving this area around 40,000 years ago. They had about 10,000 years where they're mixing with the Denisovians. So they have really only about 10,000 years that they're in this area. And so they're going to be moving on to the Turtle Islands, which is probably going to take a little bit of time. You're probably going to see that for many of them, they were boat cultures for a while in the islands of the South Pacific. But we don't name the ghost species because we don't know their genome. We don't know anything about them except for the fact that they exist. And we've really only got like a couple strands of them. So we can't tell a whole lot of information. So, like, often we can't tell what they looked like or really a whole lot about their genetics. We see that maybe sometimes we get something from them. Um, though, to my knowledge, I don't think that I'm going to shelf all of that uh, part about maybe getting something from them until I do a little bit more research on it. Um, but we just see a fingerprint of them. We don't see enough to be able to sleep, sweet, sleepy. We don't see enough to be able to say anything or do anything about who they were. So when we're seeing that movement across, we're seeing that that movement across is definitely coming um, roughly 40,000 years ago. Now it's going to go into probably these islands and these continents that are there that are no longer there first. And there probably going to be some time within that transition from one continent to the other across the South Pacific. Yet we still see that our earliest finds in Turtle Island are like 33,000 years ago. So and they're in like the southern tip of Mexico, which the southern tip of Mexico, I mean, you kind of are going around the tip of land anyways at this point, right? So it's very likely, like even if you're taking a boat route to get to the southern tip of Mexico, it's not like you're like island hopping straight there. You're gonna hit like I think that's Brazil maybe or something like that before you're gonna hit it, right? So um that being our earliest sapien find, it's likely that we were here for a little bit longer. I would say probably not up to 40,000 years. It is a possibility up to 40,000 years. Uh, I mean, you can move across the islands of the South Pacific in a generation, absolutely. So it could be up to 40,000 years. Hello, hello. Parks are amazeballs. So when we're looking at that, we're seeing that again when we're looking before at these populations where we're like they're failed populations or their populations have moved back, we have to realize that populations are moving out. They're not. I would say that for the most part, populations moving on at this point are likely populations who are groups who are moving. I want to find more. I need to find more. They might stay for a while in a space, but then your whole groups are moving on. You're not just getting like just singular space, like a band of 30 is moving on. You're getting your whole group moving on at this point. Because at this point, we're still looking at populations who are still relatively small. So you're still needing your whole group, would be the best way to put it. And so, whether you're a failed population, whether you're a moving backwards population, whether you're a moving forward population, you are you're not leaving behind at this point as much. You moving forward as a group at this point. Uh, and we see that the people within Asia and stuff like that absolutely only in that southeast southeast tip, so not really above, um, you know, the Middle East, not really above like the Arabian Peninsula, not really over in India, but really in the southeast tip of Asia are where we're seeing the Denisovans. So, and the amount of Denisovan DNA that they have in them is much greater than the amount of Denisovan DNA in Turtle Islanders. So we're not seeing groups that we're actually leaving our grandparents behind. Again, we do see that there is evidence of picking up Australasian DNA on our way over. It is this understanding that it is Australasian DNA, though, that is unique from our own, right? Like, so that it is not like unique as in, it's a different group of human or a different Homo group, but unique as in we know that Australians have been there for 70,000 years. So seeing Australian or Australasian DNA in ours is going to be a DNA that had branched off slightly earlier. And so we do see that DNA within us. We, again, and we've talked before about the backwards migration of DNA that comes later on. This, of course, is going to be much later after that ice clears. So as the ice goes up, the start is 50,000 years ago. We see that it hits along the it clears the mountains of the Caucasus region and clears the Mediterranean roughly 40,000 years ago. And people start moving over into France and into Spain and into the Italian peninsula. And then at 30,000 years ago, it's reaching the southern tip of the island of Britain. Um, it starts clearing the southern tip of the island of Britain at 27,000 years ago. When you're looking at this, you want to see that that glacial movement up is moving up like along almost like latitudinal lines. Now, I'm not saying that they're exactly along latitudinal lines, but in that method where it's just moving up along the same, it's shrinking. You might have different sections that are, like here's 100 miles where it's defrosted further back, right? But you're not going to have like it's still frozen in Greece and Siberia is defrosted, right? It's all going to be along these almost longitudinal lines as it's moving up. So yes, the southern tip of the island of Britain is 27,000 years ago is when it starts defrosting. And then we see that Ireland comes out from underneath the ice at 8,000 years ago. And our earliest finds in Scandinavia currently are 7,000 years ago. I think, though, that Scandinavia actually comes out from underneath the ice at 8,000 years ago as well. And so when we're seeing this, what we're seeing is that as the ice recedes and these regions become temperate and livable, you see that the movement up and these temperate regions mean that we are moving into them. We're seeing our earliest actual finds of people in Great Britain currently, or not Great Britain, in Britain currently are, and they're brand new and they're 14,000 years ago. There's one 13,000 years ago and one 14,000 years ago. These are not Cheddarmen, they predate Cheddarman. And we're seeing that the earliest evidence in Scandinavia is 7,000 years ago. We're seeing that people are getting a little bit earlier to the Siberian steppes and the tundra, basically, in that space. And this is because this is where we start to see our development of our ice peoples, of our Arctic regions peoples. And at this point, we can start tracing everything based by language within Eurasia. So we see the start of the Finno-Uraic language, Proto-Finno-Uraic language starting, I think it's like, oh God, 10, 15,000 years ago, where we see Proto-Indo-European starting and distinguishing at the same time too. Now, as we're seeing this, what we're seeing is that as people are leaving the Levant area, first, of course, that's that southeastern part of Eurasia, but as they're starting to temperate there, they're moving up and then they're starting to move over. And in this movement up and this movement over, first we see that we still have Neanderthal and we still have Denisovan in these regions. We know that in Denisova Cave, there is Denisova, Neanderthal, and Sapien all found within that cave. We know that the more recent finds are showing that we might have people that dating on it is 42 to 52,000 years ago of sapiens in France. This is huge news. It's one that pushes back our understanding of when sapien reaches France by 10,000 years. It's one that is being looked at like it's just a fresh article. And it's one that's kind of being studied to see and to confirm the dating and all of that sort of stuff right now. Um, as we're seeing these groups of people moving out, currently to our knowledge. So we're seeing that the Solutreans, the Gravatians, the Aluatians, these are all our earliest groups in Western Eurasia. The Solutreans are in the Iberian Peninsula at 27,000 years ago. The Gravatians and the Aleutians are like they're the same nation, two separate groups in two separate spaces, basically, like the same genetic nation. Um, and they're 35,000 years ago. Now we're seeing that there is kind of this movement down, and it's not like the ice age itself because they're not up above before the end of the last ice age, but there's like this like mini, and I think it's like it like starts at 10,000 years ago, but it doesn't spread too far, I think is what it is. And I think it's as the ice age was ending that it gets colder again and then it gets warm again. And so they're pushed down for a minute and then they go back up. And we're seeing that the Gravatians, as they're pushed down, stay the same genetic people, but and the Aleutians, as they push down, stay the same genetic people. And the Gravatians, which are more over near the Italian peninsula, end up having replacement DNA, which means that as they are pushed down into the Italian peninsula, um, their their DNA from and it's like from France down into the Italian peninsula. It's not like they were up very far as just you know uh God, I don't even know how I up a finger on the map. So, but as you're seeing that movement back up, you're seeing that the Y DNA is being replaced. That the mitochondrial DNA within this group is staying the same, but the Y DNA is being replaced. And what this tells us about this group as it's moving down and back up is that um, for some reason the men in this group are either dying off, or for some reason the men in this group have become infertile, but the Y-DNA, the actual breeding, passing of Y-DNA from father to son, which is what it only passes from, um, is replaced. Is a new Y-DNA. And I think that when they were looking at it, it's a Y-DNA out of Turkey, but I can't remember exactly sure. And then when we're looking at this, what we're seeing at this time is we're looking maybe 15,000 years ago at the end of this, right? Um, God, what is it then? There's something confusing about that article. I need to study it more. Sometimes I can't understand because it has too many numbers. So I have to go back and look at it a little bit more. Um, but what we're seeing with this is that cultures are staying and that there is some genetic replacement, but there's not a whole lot of genetic replacement. Now, of course, this is all after that ending of that last ice age. And this is all after we're seeing people really spreading throughout Western and Eastern Eurasia. By this time, we have people peopling the Turtle Islands. By this time, we have had people in Australia for like 20, 30,000 years or more, depending on which time we're in. By this time, we see that there are groups that are still staying in Africa that are not really going out of Africa. And there are groups that are in Africa that keep coming and going and moving in and out. There are groups that are returning into Africa. At this time, we see that the genetics are constantly flowing around. They're never really staying in one space. You might see that there are nations that are based on specific genetic lineages. So you might see that there's a matriarchal nation that's all based on matriarchal DNA um, or lineage. So, like, all the women choose husbands from different space, right? Or you may see that there is, a Y DNA lineage, a patriarchal DNA lineage that comes through, and all the women are coming from a different space. You are seeing almost in all spaces where one or the other DNAs, whether it's mitochondrial DNA or Y DNA, are kind of staying. Now, it should be understood that the lineage method does not necessarily mean that that is like the ruling method. So, when I talk about a matriarchal lineage or a patriarchal lineage, what we're talking about is how they trace the birth of the children, how they trace who inherits, how they trace who belongs to what family. So, most early cultures trace this through the feminine because you can tell what's coming out of a woman. You can't tell who she got pregnant by, but you can tell what's coming out of a woman, right? So even in ancient cultures, or not ancient cultures, but in older cultures where a king ruled, oftentimes that king inherited through a matriarchal line. And how that would happen is I would rule as a man, but my son would not inherit from me. My sister's son would inherit from me because I could tell that she came from my mother, or that he came from my mother. And so when we're looking at this and we're looking at whether or not something is matriarchal or patriarchal in this time, we're seeing that it is about inheritance, not inheritance, belonging more than it is about rank, more than it is about division, more than it is about who is in charge, right? Um, Point in fact, the Neanderthals, the group that they have in France that they have been able to trace family lineage with, they can tell that the men stayed in the family unit and the women came from outside the family unit. So would be a patriarchal lineage. Their inclusion in the unit, in the nation, in the band would be determined on their patriarchal connection, on who their father was. Yet, the women of really most Neanderthal finds that we have find, the women are the hunters. The women are the larger in on average. So the sexual diaphorism within Neanderthals is opposite of the sexual diaphorism within us. That word's not working today, which is the average height difference, whether or not males are taller than females on average. Within the Neanderthals, it's the opposite of us. Within the Neanderthals, the females are on average taller than the men, and the females show more of the bone wear and tendon wear that you would get with hunting activities than well, and actually I think we see it pretty equal within the Neanderthals. I know we see it pretty equal within a lot of early humans too. But the bone wear with on the bone with on the bone wear on the bones shows that women are hunting as much as men. So if not more. So we're seeing that it's not like a leadership, it's not like a who's in charge, that it is absolutely groups that are basing belonging to a group on whether or not it's matriarchal or patriarchal. Um, when we're seeing this dispersal out and this movement out, again, the last common ancestor, really the trace back of the genetics of everybody outside of Africa, is supposed to be 50,000 years ago. Of course, this can change at times. So we might find new data on this and it might change it up. Say they get DNA from that 68 to 90, or to 89,000-year-old skeleton that they just found in Asia, and they get DNA back on that, and the DNA back on that states that, this is a direct link to others, then it's no longer the failed population that they're claiming it is, right? So this is something that could change up, but this is the current knowledge. And this is the current knowledge. When we're looking at that, what we're looking at is all of these groups moving across Eurasia into space are adapting to these spaces and becoming the caretaker of these spaces in unique ways. You're seeing that there's adaptation within some of their features. You'll see that peoples that move into Arctic regions end up with the emphatic fold on the inner corner of the eye. And this is to block the sun. This is literally because when sun hits snow, it bounces back. Snow is a great reflector. And so if you are living on a glacier, or if you are living on, in an ice region or in a heavy snow region, you're going to have the sun hit the snow and bounce back up into your eyes and blind you. This is why we have this fold on the inner corner of our eye when we do. This is, let me pull it back up so that I can make sure I get the pronunciation as close to accurate, though definitely off as I can. This is the find that has been reconstructed in Jebel Irhoud, which is in Morocco. It is our earliest sapien. They have found him a while ago. And when they found him, they dated him at the time of carbon-14 dating to 40,000 years ago. The strontium isotope dating that they're doing now shows that he's actually 300,000 years old. So he is from Morocco and Northern Africa. So when we're seeing people moving into group and adapting into the space that they're in, we're seeing that this adaptation takes time, and this adaptation affects different in different areas. Like we see that people in the Arctic are getting lighter skin before people in Western Eurasia are. So, but they're keeping the darker eye, whereas people in Western Eurasia are staying dark of skin and getting a lighter eye earlier on. Now, this comes from the fact that people in Western Eurasia versus people in an Arctic climb, like the steppes, are going to be finding, again, if you've got the sun bouncing back up into your eyes, you're still in a bright sunlit environment. So you need the darker eye to keep that sun protection. If you're in a heavy cloud cover environment and you're not in a glacial environment like in Western Eurasia at this time, you have the sun not there, right? It's a cloud cover. You don't have any sun. So the low light need for the adaptation comes out. Now, of course, we know that vitamin D from the sun is absolutely important, but the vitamin D that we're getting from the sun can be gotten in other areas. So we're all still in a heavy, both vegetative and meat diet. Like our diet is very heavy in vegetation and very heavy in meat. New studies are showing that hunting actually provides a heavy vegetation diet. So gathering isn't necessarily needed as well, because you can eat the stomach contents, and many early groups ate the stomach contents, and you can get enough of the vegetation needs that you have from the stomach contents. So this is actually how people can live in Arctic climes as well. So because of the two of these things, we're seeing that you can also get vitamin D needs met from that. So the skin's staying darker for longer is understandable in comparison to the eye getting lighter earlier, because the need for the eye to get lighter is there much faster. Whereas the need for the eye color to stay dark, and again, the eye color's dark or light is really about presence of melanin in the eye as well. And that presence of melanin in the eye is again that sun protectant. It's a different kind of melanin, and it is the effect in the prismatic structure of the eye comes across differently. So it looks different, right? But it's still melanin, and that melanin is absolutely a sun protectant. So you're seeing that darker color staying within Arctic peoples. This is how you get very dark-eyed, very light-skinned Arctic peoples across the globe. Most Turtle Island indigenous people from the Arctic not most. Many Turtle Island indigenous people from the Arctic are light of skin and dark of eye with the fold of the inner eye to protect from the snow. This is also, by the way, the group that gave us sunglasses, Turtle Island indigenous Arctic people. And many people from Siberia, the Sami, the Finn, all of these groups are getting that lighter skin and keeping that darker eye earlier than other groups. As we're seeing movement from the movement in Western Eurasia is really coming across the top. So what you're looking at is that that lower half is populated. And then as the ice moves up, people are moving up. So it's not like they're moving over from Africa and then up or over, like they've moved over and down and people are here and then they're moving over and here and then we're moving over and here. It's they're moving over and they're staying in this space. And then as this space starts to clear, they're moving up. Now, again, there's still always migration. There's still always people moving back and forth. There is still always this flow. Groups, though, as nations, as cultures, as people are staying in these places, and those cultures and those nations and those people are moving up, right? So when we're seeing that, what we're seeing is there's not a whole lot of distinction in the groups in these earlier times. Now we can see a lot of this in things like the tattooing culture that we see in Russia and in China and in Western Eurasia early on is all the same tattooing culture. It is all showing similar, like they're tattooing moons on mummy or on women's eyes, like on priestesses' eyes. The mummy in the Tarim Basin, and this is in China, but it's the same style of tattooing that you get in the mummies in Russia, in the Kazakhstan mummies. Kazakhstan, is it Kazakhstan? And it's the same style of tattooing that you're getting later in the Scythians, right? So you're seeing that these tattooing ideas are really across the entirety at this time as well. Now, our earliest tattooing tools dating to 35,000 years ago currently in the Magdalena caves in France really show that this tattooing culture is something that's there for a long period of time. And as its styles are so widespread, as we go down with it, we're absolutely seeing that it shows that kind of cross cultural thought. And I don't think it is Kazakhstan off the top. Like, I think that that's what my brain came up with, but I think it's something else and I can't remember. I actually have on the website, on my website underneath the tattoo bibliography is the site that will show the mummies with tattoos in Eurasia. It doesn't show the Egyptian ones. It shows the Eurasian ones, and it only shows like two or three. But that mummy is in there. The Uruko or Oak Princess is what they call one of them. And but I know they're in Russia. I just can't remember exactly where. So when we're seeing this, what we're seeing is that again, we're finding people that are, just very cross cultural, very movement friendly, very back and forth. This even goes to Otzi. Otzi is his mother, her people, her genetics are from the Alps, the Swiss Alps where he was found. His father is Swedish and Bavarian, Swedish and Bavarian, right? So what this tells us is that Otzi's father, who himself was of two different groups or descending, and what this tells us often is who comes from them, right? Like, so what groups come from them or where we see those DNA groups at, right? So with the father, what we would see is that we see the Y DNA group for Otzi still in Sweden and still in Bavaria. We see the MT DNA group for Otzi still in the Alps. And so what this tells us is that these cultures are constantly moving around. And to my belief with the Y-DNA for Otzi, it is actual comparable to Y-DNA we see not quite that old, but old enough up in that space. Um, when we're looking at that, again, what it's telling us is that as we're moving out, we're continuing what developed us in the first place. We're continuing what we have always done, and that is mixing. We are such a huge pot of mixture, and we have been from the very beginning. We are so full of admixture. It is admixture that creates us as a species. It is admixture, it seems, that creates Homo erectus as a species. Everything about us seems to be admixture. Everything about us seems to be, hey, you're pretty. You look different. Hey, you're new. Hey, that's new. Hey, that's cool. I've never seen that before, right? Everything about us roots in that curiosity and in that love, in that need to love, in that need to not see inhumanity in the world around us. Even our need for anamorphism tells us that we see humanity in the world around us. So, in our need to see humanity in the world around us, uh, we absolutely see humanity in other species, and we absolutely see humanity in other Homo sapiens, right? At least early on, until we get that kind of indoctrinated out of us, and we decide that we can own the earth, and so we can own the land, and so we can own animals, and so we can own people. It is this constant flux and this constant intermix of peopling the Eurasian continent that we see carried off in the fact that the Bell Beaker culture is three different spaces with three different genetic lineages. So, again, mitochondrial DNA lineages and Y DNA lineages. So, when we're looking at the Bell Beakers in northern France and the Bell Beakers in Great, not apologies, in Britain, the island of Britain, and we're looking at the Bell Beakers in southern, like near the top of the Italian. No, maybe it's over a little bit further. Maybe it's near Iberia. I can't remember. When we're looking at these, two of these actually have the same DNA, and I believe it's the Iberians and the Britons actually have the same DNA linkage. But all three cultures use the same not corded ware, but the same pattern in the way that they do their pottery. And so this shows us carrying of culture across vastly, vastly different space. And it is carrying of culture across vastly different space that migration pattern really shows as well. My brain is working on half mast, and I am struggling to come up with pretty much every word I'm saying today. So I'm not going to stay on here long. I'm going to go ahead and log soon, because I'm really just struggling to come up with every word I'm saying, which is not like me usually. I do want to, and we will come back to this. We just are going to continue it today. When we're looking at that, though, I want us to look at the fact and remember that there is this constant interflux, constant intermovement, constant mixing that we're going through that is really the creation of our species. Yeah, my brain just, I get fuzzy. And I've been having a hard time sleeping is really part of it. And my neck has been really hurting. But I'm okay overall, I swear to God. It's just life. Like, here's the state of being alive. It sucks most of the time. But I am doing it, and overall I'm pretty joyous. So I am definitely okay. Um, and I often don't know why my brain decides to crap out. It just decides to crap out on me. So when we're looking at that, is absolutely that constant interflux that we start with as a species, that we continue as a species, and that we have always done as a species. People are absolutely unique in space. Ethnicity is important, and culture is important, and connection to our ancestral understanding is an extremely important thing. And understanding how important that is for everybody and allowing everybody, that is extremely important. we always have done our best to love each other and mix together. Even when we get to the Turtle Islands, we see that people have been here for 30,000, 35,000, maybe 40,000 years, and yet there is backwards migration. And yet they're still going back to Siberia and leaving their daughter DNA there. Uh, it is a constant interflow. They found rock art in Australia recently that shows Indonesian battleships, like some of the earliest Indonesian warships. So this shows that, the Indonesians were down in Australia trying to, go after, the Australians, like they're fighting in Australia. There's this constant mix, there's this constant flow. They call them battleships. I'm not sure if they're battleships or if they're like early, but they were calling them battleships. But this absolutely shows this constant flow. Everybody's getting around. And boats are so much earlier. We believe that the earliest Homo sapien boats that we have currently are 21,000 years ago in Japan. Excuse me. And at 21,000 years ago in Japan, that's what I didn't do. No, I did. Maybe. I need a medication keeper. Our earliest boats for sapien at 21,000 years ago in Japan is not the first time human made it across water. We know that Erectus had some form of crossing water. So we have constantly flowed. We have constantly ebbed. We have constantly moved. And we have constantly been a part of the world around us and interchange with it. And I'm going to leave us with that. Have a great afternoon, everybody. It is Thursday. We'll probably be back Friday. I'll definitely be on Sunday because I'm going to do an Indigenous people of Eurasia and Africa and Australia live on Sunday. Have a wonderful one, and I will talk to you guys soon. And remember, ICWA was ratified, or not ratified, but upheld today. And today our children are safe. It's a day for celebration. Much love, everyone. I'm so sorry. It does not work today.